She was balancing a crystal decanter of Macallan when she spotted the discrepancy in the logistics data that was about to cost a dangerous man his life. Keisha Simmons didn't pause, didn't let her hand shake, and certainly didn't spill a drop. That was the requirement for being a server at the Gilded Lily, a windowless, underground lounge tucked beneath the city's concrete like a dark secret the underworld kept for its elite. In this room, you learned how to make your face a blank slate while your mind was running numbers at a genius level. She set the scotch down, smoothed her white blouse, and faded back into the shadows. Now, before we go any further, if you've ever watched a trap close around someone dangerous, someone who represents everything you use to investigate, would you mind your business, or would you risk your own life to stop it? Stay with me, because what Keisha did next destroyed her invisibility and set a city on fire. Drop a comment right now. When you have nothing left to lose, is the truth a weapon or a suicide note? Keep that in mind, because by the end of this story, you might realize that silence is the most expensive thing you can own. The private booth was tucked in the deepest corner of the lounge, shielded by heavy velvet curtains and a level of silence that cost a premium and came without witnesses. 3 men, 1 tense negotiation, and a contract sitting in the center of the table like a loaded weapon dressed in legalese. Keisha had been assigned to this table specifically because she was a master of being a ghost. For 8 months, she had worked at the Gilded Lily. 8 months of carrying glasses that cost more than her monthly rent, serving men who never looked her in the eye, and hiding the fact that she was a former forensic accountant whose career had been incinerated by the very systems she tried to protect. She was invisible by necessity. She needed the radar to stay clear of her. But some betrayals are so loud that even a woman trying to disappear can't ignore them. The man at the head of the table was Park Myung-ok. He was younger than the others, his presence defined by a controlled, dangerous elegance and shoulder-length black hair that framed a face of absolute, unreadable stillness. A complex, dark tattoo crawled up his neck and disappeared beneath the collar of a charcoal suit that whispered of power. Across from him sat his business partner, a man with a sharp suit and a sharper smile, the kind of face you trust right up until you see the poison pill hidden in his logistics paperwork. Keisha noticed the trap the moment she refilled the water glasses. It would have been impossible not to. She could read a ledger the way most people read a menu. The partner was steering Myung-ok toward a deal that wasn't a partnership. It was a death warrant. She wrote the order down, turned to walk away, and that should have been the end of it. Just another invisible shift for an invisible woman. Except that some lies are too loud to let stand. The weight of a tray is different from the weight of a legacy, but Keisha Simmons knew how to carry both without breaking her stride. 2 years ago, her hands had been stained with ink and digital footprints rather than the cold condensation of expensive glassware. Back then, she didn't wear a polyester blend. She wore Italian wool that commanded silence the moment she entered a boardroom. She wasn't just a forensic accountant. She was the scalp hunter for the city's most prestigious firm, Sterling and Associates. She was the woman you called when the numbers didn't add up and you needed to know which shadow was stealing the light. Her mind was a biological supercomputer, a grid of logic and patterns that could spot a fraudulent decimal point across 3 different currencies and 6 shell companies. She loved the clean, clinical truth of a balanced ledger. People lied, but numbers were honest, until they were forced to hide secrets they were never meant to hold. The fall began with the Apex project. It was supposed to be her career-defining audit, a deep dive into a multinational logistics firm that seemed too profitable to be legal. Keisha spent 3 weeks fueled by bitter coffee and the thrill of the hunt, peeling back layers of synthetic trades and phantom inventory. She found it on a Tuesday at 3 a.m., a hidden subledger that linked the company's CEO directly to a massive money laundering circuit. She did what she had been trained to do. She took the evidence to Marcus Thorne, the senior partner who had been her mentor since she graduated at the top of her class. She expected a promotion, a thank you, or at the very least, a call to the authorities. Instead, she received a cold, measured look that she would see in her nightmares for the next 24 months. Marcus didn't just bury the evidence, he buried Keisha. By the end of the week, the internal server logs were scrubbed of her findings and replaced with forged entries that made it look like she was the one skimming from the client accounts. The betrayal was surgical. Her passwords were changed, her hard drive was wiped, and a forensic trail was laid that led straight to her personal bank account. Within 48 hours, she wasn't the star accountant anymore. She was a pariah. The firm fired her for gross professional misconduct, and the state board moved with terrifying speed to suspend her CPA license. The headlines in the local business journals were brutal, painting her as a greedy opportunist who had bitten the hand that fed her. She tried to fight, but Marcus had deeper pockets and friends in high places who didn't want the truth of the Apex project to ever see the light of day. She watched her life dismantle itself piece by piece. The sleek apartment in Midtown was the first to go, followed by the luxury sedan and the circles of friends who suddenly found their phones too heavy to pick up when she called. She learned the hard way that when the world decides you are a villain, the truth is just noise. She spent 6 months in a cramped studio in a part of town where the sirens never stopped, watching her savings evaporate while she applied for jobs that wouldn't even give her an interview. Her name was a digital stain. She was overqualified for retail and blacklisted from finance. That was when she realized that if she wanted to survive, she had to become someone else. She had to become a ghost. The Gilded Lily was the kind of place where ghosts gathered to drink. The owner, a man with a scarred face and a lack of curiosity about the past, didn't care about her CPA license or her disgraced reputation. He cared that she could handle the high-pressure environment of the VIP lounge and that she knew how to stay invisible. Keisha took the job, tucking her genius behind a polite smile and a professional bun. She traded her spreadsheets for spirit lists in her office for a room filled with smoke and dangerous men. For 8 months, she had been a shadow in a white blouse, watching the underworld move its money with the same greed she had seen in the corporate world, only with less paperwork and more blood. She thought she was safe in her anonymity, a silent observer of the city's sins. But the thing about being a hunter is that you never truly lose the instinct. Even as she placed the scotch on the table for Park Myung-ok, her eyes couldn't help but lock onto the paperwork lying open like a fresh wound. Her brain, the one she tried to dull with the monotony of service, surged back to life. She saw the familiar patterns of a poison pill contract, the exact same structure Marcus Thorne had used to frame her. The business partner across from Myung-ok was smiling, but Keisha could see the cold calculation in his eyes. He wasn't just making a deal, he was orchestrating an execution. She felt the old fire of the auditor rising up, a burning need for the numbers to be right, even if the man holding them was a monster. She looked at Myung-ok, at the calm dominance of his posture and the tattoos that marked him as a king of this dark world, and she realized the irony. She had spent her career trying to bring down men like him, but now, she was the only thing standing between him and a total, orchestrated collapse. She tightened her grip on the empty tray, the metal cold against her palms. The noise of the lounge faded into a dull hum, leaving only the rhythm of her own heart. She could walk away, finish her shift, and stay invisible. Or she could speak, break the silence of the ghost she had become, and risk the very survival she had fought so hard to scrape together. She looked at the man who was about to sign away his empire to a liar, and for the first time in 2 years, Keisha Simmons decided that being a ghost wasn't enough. She wasn't just a waitress in an apron, she was a witness. And some truths were worth the fire they started. Keisha moved like smoke through the heavy velvet atmosphere of the booth, her senses heightened to a degree that made every clink of ice sound like a gavel. Park Myung-ok sat at the center of the frame, a masterpiece of lethal composure. His shoulder-length hair caught the low amber light of the chandelier, and his neck tattoo, an intricate sprawl of ink that looked like a dragon's tail, seemed to shift with every shallow breath he took. He was the anchor of the room, yet it was the man sitting directly across from him who held Keisha's forensic focus. This man, an older associate whom Myung-ok referred to as Director Choi, was a study in physiological leakage. To the untrained eye, he looked like a seasoned veteran of the underworld, comfortable and confident in his pinstriped luxury. To Keisha, he was a walking red flag, a symphony of tales that screamed of a man who had already sold his soul and was now just waiting for the check to clear. She noticed the way his thumb rhythmically stroked the edge of his crystal glass, not a gesture of relaxation, but a self-soothing mechanism to mask a sharp spike in cortisol. She leaned in to refresh the sparkling water, her movements practiced and fluid, bringing her eyes within inches of the documents splayed across the polished mahogany. The contract was a work of art, bound in soft calfskin. Most people would see the figures and the authoritative seals of offshore holding companies. Keisha, however, saw the architecture. Her mind automatically mapped the flow of capital, identifying the ghost entries she had spent years tracking. It was in the logistics annex, tucked away under the dense legalese of Section 8.4, where the betrayal truly lived. The customs clearance codes for the Busan port shipments were subtly altered, a single digit transposed in the international trade classification that changed the cargo from industrial machinery to restricted hardware. It was a classic poison pill, a bureaucratic landmine designed to trigger an immediate federal seizure and an automatic RICO investigation the moment the first container hit the docks. Myung-ok wasn't just signing a merger. He was signing a formal confession that would give his enemies the legal leverage to dismantle his entire empire while he sat in a windowless cell. The director gave a short, barking laugh, his voice a fraction too high. He pushed the heavy gold pen toward Myung-ok with a flourish that felt performative. Keisha watched the director's left foot. It was turned sharply toward the exit, the subconscious lead foot of someone who was already mentally halfway out the door, fleeing the scene of a crime before the ink was even dry. The air in the booth felt thick and heavy, charged with the static of an impending explosion. Myung-ok reached for the pen, his fingers tattooed with small, precise symbols. His movements were slow and deliberate. He trusted the structure of his world, never suspecting that the rot had started so close to the heart of his inner circle. Keisha felt the familiar, phantom itch in her fingertips, a visceral reaction to an imbalance in the world's ledgers. Myung-ok was a mountain, still and rooted. Director Choi was the erosion at the base, frantic and hidden. Keisha stepped back into the periphery, her tray pressed against her hip like a shield. She looked at the back of Myung-ok's head and felt a sudden, sharp pang of recognition. He was being handled exactly the same way she had been handled. They weren't just taking his money. They were taking his legacy, using his own signature to bury him. She watched Choi lean forward, his eyes locked on the pen in Myung-ok's hand, his breathing shallowing as the climax of his deception approached. He was a predator who thought he was invisible, unaware that he was being dissected by the woman who had just cleared his plates. The scent of expensive tobacco and lies hung heavy. Keisha saw the microscopic tremor in Choi's hand as he adjusted his gold cufflinks, the final surge of adrenaline before a strike. The room was a vacuum, the curtains muffling the main floor. Keisha knew that the moment the signature was dry, the trap was sprung. She looked at her reflection in the polished table, a woman the world decided was powerless. But as she watched Myung-ok's hand descend, she realized that true power was about the truth she could see. The director gave a small nod, his face a mask of anticipation that flickered with greed. It broke her hesitation. She moved from the shadows to the storm. The pen touched the paper, the stroke that would seal a fate, and Keisha Simmons realized that the thing more dangerous than speaking was the silence that would follow the death of the truth. The nib of the Mont Blanc pen hovered mere millimeters above the heavy vellum, a tiny point of gravity that threatened to pull Keisha's entire fragile world into its orbit. In the suffocating silence of the private booth, the only sound was the low, rhythmic hum of the ventilation system and the frantic, internal metronome of Keisha's own heartbeat. She stood paralyzed in the amber-tinted shadows, her fingers white-knuckled against the edge of her serving tray. To any other observer, she was merely waiting for a signature to be finalized so she could clear the table, but to Keisha, this was the moment of total atmospheric collapse. She was staring at the barrel of a gun she had seen before, one loaded with the same caliber of corporate malice that had dismantled her life 2 years ago. If she stayed silent, the man with the dragon tattoo would fall, and the machine of corruption would grind on, undisturbed. If she spoke, she was effectively signing her own death warrant, trading her hard-won anonymity for a chance to scream into the void one last time. The face of her mother, Evelyn, flickered into her mind like a faded photograph caught in a sudden breeze. Evelyn was currently resting in a specialized care facility 3 towns over, tucked into a bed with high thread count sheets that Keisha's grueling shifts at the Gilded Lily barely covered. Her mother didn't recognize her anymore, her memories having dissolved into a soft, lavender-scented fog, but she still smiled when Keisha brushed her hair. That smile was the only thing Keisha had left to protect. If she interfered now, if she revealed the forensic genius hiding beneath the polyester blend of her uniform, she would become a target. Men like Director Choi didn't just fire people, they erased them. If she were removed from the equation, there would be no one left to pay for the extra physical therapy, no one to ensure that Evelyn wasn't moved to a state-run ward where the air smelled of bleach and neglect. The truth wasn't just a weapon in this room. It was a luxury she couldn't afford. She watched the director's eyes, which were fixed on the pen with a predatory intensity that made her skin crawl. He was so close to winning, so close to watching Myung-ok's empire dissolve into a series of federal seizures and asset liquidations. Keisha knew the anatomy of this betrayal because it was a mirror image of the Apex project. The same shell companies, the same transposed digits in the customs annex, the same poison pill hidden in the fine print of Section 8.4. It was a beautiful, lethal piece of accounting, and she was the only person in the building who understood how it worked. She felt the phantom weight of her CPA license, the one that had been stripped away by men exactly like Choi. To let this happen again, to watch another life be incinerated by a ledger, felt like a betrayal of the very logic that governed her soul. She had spent her life believing that numbers were the ultimate truth, and now, the numbers were being used to execute a man who didn't even know he was being hunted. The suicide note wasn't just a metaphor. If she spoke, she was inviting the monsters back into her life. Marcus Thorne and his associates would find out she was still alive, still working, still capable of seeing through their curtains of lies. They would come for her, and they would come for Evelyn. Keisha's breath caught in her throat as she weighed the safety of her mother's quiet room against the roaring fire of her own integrity. She looked at Park Myung-ok. He was a man of violence, a man who likely had blood on the very hands that now held the pen, yet there was a dignity in his stillness that Choi lacked. Myung-ok was a king of the dark, but Choi was a parasite. The injustice of the situation began to burn in the pit of her stomach, a hot, acidic resentment that tasted like the cheap coffee she drank to stay awake during the night shift. She realized then that silence wasn't just a shield, it was a slow-acting poison. If she let this pass, she would be no better than the partners at Sterling and Associates who had looked the other way while her career was gutted. She would be a ghost, yes, but a ghost with no soul. The director shifted slightly, his expensive charcoal suit crinkling with a sound like dry leaves, and a smug, microscopic grin began to tug at the corner of his mouth. He thought he was the smartest person in the room. He thought the woman in the apron was a non-entity, a piece of the furniture designed to serve and disappear. That arrogance was his only weakness. Keisha felt a sudden, sharp clarity wash over her, a cold resolve that stilled the trembling in her hands. She couldn't save her old life, and she might not be able to save her future, but she could refuse to be a silent witness to a lie. The pen's tip finally touched the paper, the ink beginning to bleed into the fiber. It was now or never. The distance between her current life and the fire she was about to start was a single breath. She thought of her mother's smile one last time, tucking it away in a corner of her heart where no one could touch it, and then she stepped forward, breaking the sacred invisibility of the server. The tray in her hand felt light as a feather as she leaned into the circle of light. The truth was a weapon, and she was tired of being the only one who was unarmed. Keisha Simmons took a breath, cleared her throat, and prepared to set the city on fire, knowing exactly how much it would cost to finally speak the truth out loud. The silence of the Gilded Lily was about to end, and for the first time in 2 years, the auditor was back on the clock. Keisha's hand didn't shake as she reached for the empty bottle, but the air solidified. The fine crystal of the bottle felt like ice against her palm. She leaned down, her hair brushing the mahogany, and the scent of ink and betrayal filled her lungs. The customs clearance code in Section 8.4 is a transposed trap, she breathed, the words barely a ripple in the silence. Your signature is a formal confession to the Busan port seizure. The silence that followed was a physical weight that pressed against the walls. Director Choi's face drained of color, his features slackening into terror as his eyes darted from Keisha to the man across from him. Park Myung-ok did not move, but the temperature plummeted in a single, breathless instant. The nib of the Mont Blanc pen stayed frozen against the vellum, a single, slow drop of ink bleeding into the paper like a dark omen. It was a visceral stain on the luxury document, a visual representation of the corruption she had just named. The director's heavy gold cufflinks clinked as he twitched, a sound like a funeral bell. Myung-ok's fingers, etched with precise symbols, remained perfectly still. He didn't look at the contract or at Choi. Instead, he slowly lifted his head with the terrifying grace of a king cobra. His eyes, dark pools of cold intellect, found Keisha's face. He didn't ask her who she was. He simply watched her, dissecting her with a gaze that felt like a surgical blade peeling back her skin. What did she say? Choi's voice was a jagged rasp, the sound of a man watching his life's work crumble. He tried to laugh, but it was a pathetic, wheezing choke. She's just a waitress, Myung-ok. She's confused. She's interrupting a private matter. Myung-ok raised his left hand, a minute gesture that silenced the director as effectively as a gag. The room remained held in crystalline stasis, the world outside the curtains ceasing to exist. Myung-ok's gaze remained locked on Keisha, searching for a tremor, a lie, or an ulterior motive. He lived in a world of calculated risks and was currently recalculating the value of the woman standing before him. The silence stretched until it became a thin wire pulled to the breaking point. Finally, Myung-ok's lips moved, his voice a low vibration that resonated in the hollow of Keisha's throat. "Leave," he said. It wasn't a question, but a stay of execution. Keisha didn't wait for a second command. She pulled her tray back to her chest, the metal cool against her palms. She turned and walked toward the heavy velvet curtains, every step feeling like she was moving through knee-deep water. Behind her, she could hear the frantic, shuffling sound of Choi trying to regain control, his voice a desperate whisper as he attempted to explain away the mistake in the document. But Keisha knew it was over for him. The predator had been alerted to the scent of the trap, and trust had evaporated. As she pushed through the heavy curtains and stepped onto the main floor of the Gilded Lily, the roar of the jazz band felt like a physical assault. She didn't look back, but she could feel Park Myung-ok's eyes on her spine, a cold, phantom weight following her through the crowded room. Even as she retreated toward the kitchen, weaving past oblivious socialites, the sensation of his gaze remained. It was a tether, a silver thread of curiosity and danger. She knew that her life as a ghost was over. She had chosen to be seen, and now, a man who dealt in the currency of secrets had her in his sights. The thought of Evelyn's quiet room felt 1,000 miles away, replaced by the sharp, metallic taste of a war she had just declared. Keisha reached the swinging doors of the kitchen, her breath coming in shallow, ragged bursts. She gripped the edge of the stainless steel table, her knuckles white, her mind already racing through the fallout. She had saved him, but in doing so, she had exposed the very thing she had spent 2 years burying. She wasn't just a server anymore. She was a variable in a high-stakes equation she no longer controlled. Outside, the party continued, the elite oblivious to the fact that the atmosphere in the private booth had just changed the trajectory of the city's underworld. Keisha closed her eyes, trying to find the cold logic of the numbers again, but all she could see was her own defiance in the dark eyes of the man with the dragon tattoo. The audit had only just begun, and the numbers were finally starting to move again. The reckoning was coming, and she was the one holding the ledger. There was no turning back now. The storm had finally arrived. The manager's office was a claustrophobic box of mahogany and mirrors, designed to make the help feel small while the owners felt infinite. Marcus Sterling didn't look up from his ledger when Keisha walked in, but the air seemed to curdle around him. He traded in the comfort of the elite, and Keisha had just introduced a jagged edge into his smooth, expensive world. When he finally spoke, his voice was a dry rasp. "You were a good worker, Keisha. Quiet, efficient, almost invisible." He finally met her eyes, and there was a flicker of something that might have been pity if it weren't so heavily buried under self-preservation. But visibility is terminal here. You didn't just break protocol, you shattered the illusion. I can't have a server who thinks she's a partner. I can't have a server who thinks she's anything at all. He didn't care about the fraud or the Busan port seizure. He cared about the silence that had been violated. He slid a thin envelope across the desk, a severance that felt like hush money. "Don't come back. If I see you within 3 blocks, I'll call the police. Now, get out before I decide to withhold the tips you haven't earned." The walk to the locker room was a gauntlet of averted gazes. Her coworkers looked through her as if she had already become the ghost she was pretending to be. She changed out of the uniform with mechanical precision, the polyester blend feeling like a shroud she was finally shedding. Her own clothes, a simple pair of jeans and a thin sweater, felt foreign, a reminder of the life she had once occupied before the audit and the flight. She stepped out of the service entrance and into the thick, suffocating heat of the Georgia night. The city hummed with a low, electric anxiety, the neon signs of Buckhead bleeding into the hazy sky like watercolor paint on a wet canvas. She felt the shift in the atmosphere immediately. It wasn't just the humidity. It was the sensation of 1,000 eyes watching from the darkened windows of the surrounding towers. She was no longer part of the scenery. She was a target moving across a very large, very bright chessboard. The safety of the crowd had evaporated, leaving her standing in the stark light of consequences of her own making. The employee lot was a gravel-strewn rectangle of neglected land tucked behind the glimmering facade of the restaurant. It was poorly lit, the single buzzing halogen lamp casting long, distorted shadows that danced across the hoods of the cars. Keisha's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird seeking an exit. Every crunch of gravel beneath her feet sounded like a gunshot in the oppressive quiet. She saw them before they saw her. 2 men stood by the far fence, their silhouettes sharp and angular against the chain link. They weren't wearing the uniforms of the Lilly's security. They were dressed in the anonymous, high-end tactical gear of corporate fixers. These were the men who made problems go away, the ones who scrubbed away the blood and the data. They didn't move toward her at first. They simply watched, their stillness more terrifying than any overt threat. They were the shadows of the partners, the cleanup crew sent to ensure that whatever Keisha had whispered in that booth remained a secret forever. She reached her old sedan, her fingers trembling so violently she nearly dropped her keys against the unforgiving gravel. Behind her, she heard the synchronized, heavy click of 2 car doors closing. A dark SUV, parked in the shadows, flicked its headlights on, 2 predatory, amber eyes cutting through the gloom. It wasn't a coincidence. It wasn't paranoia. This was the moment the frying pan gave way to the fire. She scrambled into the driver's seat, the interior smelling of stale coffee and the lavender lotion she used on her mother's hands. She locked the doors, the sound of the tumblers falling into place providing a cold, metallic comfort that she knew was entirely illusory. The SUV began to roll forward, a slow, deliberate crawl that mirrored her own mounting panic. They weren't just following her. They were herding her toward a destination of their choosing, a silent conversation between hunter and prey. The suicide note she had written by telling the truth was being delivered in real time. As she threw the car into reverse, the tires spitting gravel into the air, she realized that the Gilded Lily had only been a temporary sanctuary. Now, the walls were gone, and the monsters she had spent 2 years running from had finally found her scent in the dark. She was the ghost that had finally been cornered, and the long, cold night was just beginning. The engine of Keisha's sedan groaned, a mechanical protest against the frantic demand for speed as she swung the car toward the exit. But the dark SUV was faster, a silent predator that didn't need to roar to prove its dominance. It cut across the gravel path with surgical precision, the tires kicking up a spray of gray stones that rattled against Keisha's passenger door like a volley of small arms fire. She slammed on the brakes, her chest heaving, as a second vehicle, a nondescript silver sedan, materialized from the mouth of the alleyway to her left. They had her boxed in. The halogen light above flickered and died, plunging the lot into a bruised purple twilight that felt final. She sat frozen behind the wheel, the smell of burnt rubber and old upholstery thick in her throat. The doors of the SUV opened in unison, and the 2 men she had seen earlier stepped out. They didn't run. They didn't shout. They moved with the terrifying, unhurried confidence of people who knew there were no heroes coming to save a disgraced waitress in the middle of a Buckhead night. One of them, a man with a face as flat and featureless as a slab of concrete, tapped a heavy ring against her driver's side window. The sound was sharp, rhythmic, and devastating. He didn't need to speak. The message was written in the cold vacuum of his eyes. They weren't here to talk about her severance package. They were the erasure team, sent to ensure the Busan's secret died in the gravel. Keisha reached for her phone, but her hands were numb, her fingers feeling like lead weights. Just as the man with the ring reached into his jacket, a movement so fluid it felt practiced 1,000 times over, a sudden, blinding glare erupted from the street entrance. A black sedan, its engine a low, guttural thrum that vibrated in the very marrow of Keisha's bones, tore into the lot. It didn't slow down. It drifted across the gravel with a violent elegance, forcing the corporate fixers to dive back toward their own vehicle to avoid being crushed. The new arrival came to a halt inches from Keisha's front bumper, a sleek, armored barrier between her and the shadows. The door of the black sedan opened, and a man stepped out into the swirling dust. He was younger than the fixers, dressed in a sharp, charcoal-colored suit that seemed to absorb the dim light around them. He didn't look like a bodyguard. He looked like a blade that had been polished until it was dangerous to touch. This was the silent enforcer of Myung-ok, a man whose reputation was a whisper of fear in the underworlds of both Seoul and Atlanta. He didn't pull a weapon. He simply stood there, his posture relaxed but coiled, his gaze fixed on the two fixers with an intensity that made the air feel heavy. Behind him, 3 other men emerged from the shadows of the parking lot's perimeter, moving with a predatory grace that far outmatched the corporate crew. They wore the subtle insignia of the dragon, a small, silver pin on their lapels that caught the distant streetlights. The fixers hesitated. They were professionals, but they were also pragmatists. They knew the difference between a cleanup job and a war. The man with the concrete face looked from the enforcer to the men closing in from the flanks, his expression shifting from predatory to wary. The power dynamic of the parking lot had flipped in a heartbeat. The hunters had suddenly become the hunted. The silent enforcer stepped forward, his shoes crunching on the gravel with a slow, deliberate tempo. He stopped 5 feet from the lead fixer and simply tilted his head toward the exit. It was a wordless command, a dismissal backed by the weight of an empire the fixers were not prepared to challenge. For a long, agonizing minute, the only sound was the ticking of cooling engines and the distant, rhythmic hum of the city. Then, without a word, the fixers retreated. They backed into their SUV, their movements stiff and defensive, and reversed out of the lot with a haste that betrayed their sudden realization of how close they had come to disappearing. Keisha watched them go, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She expected the enforcer to approach her, to demand something, or to explain why he had intervened. Instead, he simply turned his back to her car and looked toward the street, his eyes scanning the horizon for any further threats. One of the other men, an older Korean man with a scar running through his eyebrow, walked to her window and gestured for her to roll it down. When she did, the cool night air rushed in, carrying the scent of expensive cologne and ozone. "You have friends you didn't know you had, Miss Keisha," the man said, his voice a low, melodic rumble. "Myung-ok does not like it when people touch what belongs to her. And right now, your information makes you very valuable." He didn't smile, but there was a flicker of something resembling respect in his eyes. "Follow the car. We are taking you to a place where the shadows cannot reach." Keisha looked at the enforcer, who remained a silent sentry at the edge of the light. He was the dragon's tooth, a reminder that while she was out of the frying pan, she had entered a world where the protection was just as dangerous as the threat. She shifted the car into gear, her hands finally steadying. The black sedan began to move, and she followed it out of the lot, leaving the gilded lily and its secrets behind. As they sped through the neon-lit corridors of the city, she realized that the truth hadn't just set her free, it had claimed her. She was no longer a waitress or a ghost. She was a piece on a much larger board, and for the first time in 2 years, she wasn't running alone. The dragon had spread its wings over her, and the night, though still dark, no longer felt like a grave. The black sedan moved through the outskirts of Atlanta like a shadow sliding over dark water, the city's neon pulse fading into the deep, humid greens of the Georgia countryside. Keisha sat in the back, her fingers tracing the rough seam of her jeans, the silence in the car as heavy as the armored glass. Beside her, the enforcer was a statue of charcoal wool and sharp angles, his gaze fixed on the road ahead, as if he were scanning for threats that didn't yet exist. They turned off a secondary highway onto a long, unmarked gravel drive that climbed upward, the trees closing in around them until the rest of the world felt like a distant, discarded memory. At the crest of the hill sat the estate, not a sprawling mansion of glass and ego, but a traditional structure that looked as if it had been transported, stone by stone, from a mountain in Korea. It was a place of dark timber and low-slung roofs, illuminated by the soft, amber glow of paper lanterns that flickered in the evening breeze. They led her through a series of courtyards where the only sound was the rhythmic clack of a bamboo water pipe and the distant hum of cicadas. The air here was different, scrubbed clean of the city's exhaust and replaced with the scent of cedarwood, incense, and damp earth. Finally, they reached a private shrine at the heart of the estate. It was a small, open-sided pavilion that smelled of ancient paper and barley tea. In the center, seated on a silk cushion before a low table, was Myung-ok. She was a woman who didn't need a throne to project power. Her authority was woven into the very stillness of her posture. Her eyes, sharp and obsidian, tracked Keisha's approach with a terrifyingly neutral intensity. "You have caused a great deal of movement tonight, Miss Keisha," Myung-ok said, her voice a low, melodic vibration that seemed to command the very air in the room. She didn't offer a seat, nor did she offer a smile. She simply waited, a predator observing a curious new variable that had entered her territory. "My partners tell me you are a waitress who hears things she shouldn't. They tell me you are a ghost. But I do not believe in ghosts. I believe in information, and I believe in the cost of silence." Keisha felt the weight of the room pressing against her chest, the same claustrophobia she had felt in Marcus Sterling's office. But this was different. This wasn't the petty greed of a restaurant manager. This was the cold, calculated machinery of an empire. She knew that if she faltered now, she would never leave this hill. She reached into her pocket, but her fingers found only the severance envelope and a stray pen she had swiped from the host's stand in her final moments at the Gilded Lily. She realized she had no files, no recordings, no physical proof of the Busan seizure. She had only her mind and the truth that lived in the margins of what she had seen. "I don't have the contracts," Keisha said, her voice steady despite the hammer of her heart. "But I have the numbers. And numbers don't lie, even when the people carrying them do." She stepped forward, unbidden, and reached for a stack of white linen napkins resting on a lacquer tray near the tea service. The enforcer shifted, a subtle, lethal movement, but Myung-ok raised a single hand to stay him. Keisha took a napkin and smoothed it out on the low table, the fabric pale and stark against the dark wood. With the cheap ballpoint pen, she began to write. She didn't draw a map or a diagram. She wrote out the ledger lines she had glimpsed for only a few seconds on the partner's tablet. She reconstructed the profit margins of the Busan Port Authority, the hidden subclauses of the seizure warrants, and the specific, anomalous percentages that had been diverted into a shell company she recognized from her old life as an auditor. The ink bled slightly into the linen, blurring the edges of the figures, but the logic remained razor-sharp. She circled a single number at the bottom of the napkin, the discrepancy that turned a legal seizure into a multi-million-dollar fraud. She pushed the napkin across the table toward Myung-ok. The older woman didn't look at it immediately. She looked at Keisha, searching for the crack in her resolve, for the telltale flicker of a lie. Finding none, she finally lowered her gaze to the makeshift ledger. The silence that followed was absolute. Myung-ok studied the napkin with the focus of a grandmaster reading a chessboard. She saw the fraud not as a collection of digits, but as a map of the betrayal happening within her own inner circle. The cleanup crew hadn't just been following Keisha to protect the secret. They had been following her because she was the only mirror reflecting the truth of their own theft. Myung-ok's expression didn't change, but the atmosphere in the shrine shifted. The coldness didn't vanish, but it redirected. It was no longer aimed at Keisha. It was now a weapon being unsheathed for those who had dared to steal from the dragon. "A waitress who audits," Myung-ok whispered, more to herself than to Keisha. She looked at the napkin one last time before folding it with precise, agonizing slowness. "You are correct. These numbers do not belong to the partners. They belong to me." She looked up, and for the first time, there was a glimmer of something resembling respect in her dark eyes. "You were right to come here. The frying pan you jumped from was small. The fire you are in now is mine. But as long as you provide me with the truth, I will ensure that the flames do not touch you." She gestured to the enforcer. "Prepare a room. Miss Keisha is no longer a ghost. She is a guest." As Keisha was led away, she realized the pen was still in her hand, a small, plastic reminder that the truth was the only weapon she had left. Keisha leaned forward, her eyes narrowing as she traced the bleeding ink on the white linen. The numbers were jagged, born of a cheap ballpoint pen and a memory that functioned like a steel trap. To anyone else, it was a messy collection of percentages and acronyms, but to the man with the dragon tattoo, it was a map of a betrayal he had nearly signed into law. The silence of the pavilion was absolute, save for the rhythmic clack of the bamboo water pipe in the courtyard, a sound that felt like the ticking of a clock counting down the seconds of Keisha's life. Keisha didn't look away, even as the enforcer loomed like a shadow at the edge of her peripheral vision. She had spent 2 years becoming a ghost, but standing in this shrine, she felt more solid than she had since the day Marcus Thorne incinerated her career. Director Choi was a parasite, Myung-ok finally said, his voice barely louder than the night breeze. He believed that because I wear my history on my skin, I am a creature of impulse. He thought the tattoos were a warning of a shallow mind. She looked up from the napkin, his obsidian eyes locking onto Keisha's with a weight that made the Georgia humidity feel like a physical burden. Most people look at me and see only the violence. They see the ink and they start to lie before they even open their mouths. They are so afraid of my temper that they forget I can read a balance sheet. But you didn't look at the dragon. You looked at the math. Keisha wiped her damp palms on her jeans, her mind racing through the implications of the man's words. "Numbers are the only thing that don't change when the lights go out," she replied, her voice regaining the clinical edge of her Sterling and Associates days. Choi's error wasn't the code, it was the arrogance. He assumed a waitress wouldn't know the difference between a customs clearance and a confession. He assumed the help was part of the furniture. Myung-ok stood, his charcoal suit crinkling with a sound like dry leaves. He walked to the edge of the pavilion, looking out over the dark trees that shielded his empire. "I have 1,000 men who can pull a trigger, Miss Keisha. I have dozens of lawyers who can bury a body in paperwork. But I do not have anyone who can see the poison pill before the bottle is uncorked. My world is filled with people who are too terrified of my reputation to tell me when the foundation is rotting." He turned back, his lethal composure softening into something that looked dangerously like an invitation. "The Gilded Lily was a cage for a woman of your intellect. You were hiding a Ferrari in a scrapyard. I am offering you a different kind of visibility." Keisha felt the phantom weight of her mother's smile. She thought of Evelyn in that specialized care facility, the high thread count sheets, and the lavender-scented fog of her fading memories. The severance envelope in her pocket was a joke, a temporary fix for a permanent problem. Myung-ok was offering a lifeline, but it was one forged in the same fires that had burned Keisha's old life to the ground. "You want an auditor?" Keisha stated, not a question but a realization. "I want a scalp hunter," Myung-ok corrected, using the very title Keisha had once carried with pride. "I have legitimate interests that require a forensic eye, and illegitimate ones that require a ghost. I need someone who isn't afraid of my temper or the symbols on my neck. I need the woman who saw the truth in a dark booth while the world was looking the other way. My business is expanding, and the more light I crave, the more shadows I create. I need you to find the people stealing that light." The offer hung in the air, a legitimate role that would serve as the most dangerous mask Keisha had ever worn. It was a contract written in the margins of the underworld, a chance to regain her status by protecting the very systems she once sought to regulate. The irony wasn't lost on her. She was being recruited by the dragon to hunt the rats. If she said yes, the search for her mother's safety would be over, but the war for her own soul would truly begin. The auditor was back on the clock, but the client was no longer a firm of Italian wool and glass towers. "I have conditions," Keisha said, her heart finally steadying. "I don't just find the discrepancies. I find the people behind them. And I do it my way." Myung-ok's lips curved into the first hint of a smile Keisha had seen, a cold, sharp expression that signaled a new kind of storm. "The numbers must be right, Miss Keisha. That is the only condition I require." In the quiet of the shrine, the ghost died, and the partner was born. The city was still on fire, But now, Keisha Simmons held the fuel. The air was thick with the scent of cedar and the heavy, metallic tang of the decision he had just made. Keisha stood in the pavilion, her fingers still stained with the ink of the cheap ballpoint pen that had just redrawn the map of a criminal empire. Park Myung-ok watched her with a stillness that was more terrifying than any scream, his obsidian eyes calculating the worth of the woman who had once been a ghost in her lounge. For 8 months, Keisha had moved through the Gilded Lily, that windowless, underground lounge, as a non-entity. She had been the one who refilled scotch and smoothed white blouses, someone whose presence was designed to be ignored by the powerful men who conducted dark business behind heavy velvet curtains. But as he stood amidst the timber and paper lanterns of the estate, he realized that her invisibility hadn't been a weakness. It had been her greatest tactical advantage. The powerful, he understood now, were often blinded by the brilliance of their own theater. Director Choi had walked into that private booth wearing pinstriped luxury, assuming that the woman clearing his plates was as deaf as the polished mahogany table. He had performed his deception with a flourish, pushing a heavy gold pen toward Myung-ok, as if the act of signing were the only reality that mattered in the room. He never suspected that the waitress was a scalp hunter from the city's most prestigious firm, a woman capable of reading a ledger the way most people read a dinner menu. He never imagined that his physiological leakage was being documented by a mind that functioned like a biological supercomputer. The elite spent fortunes on encrypted servers to keep their secrets, yet they offered those same secrets up to the help every single time they spoke too loudly over a tray of Macallan. They believed that status was found in the Italian wool of a charcoal suit or the intricate sprawl of a dragon tattoo, but Keisha knew better. True power wasn't in the optics of wealth. It was in the absolute accuracy of the information and the silence of the one who held it. "You are thinking about the irony," Myung-ok said, his voice a melodic vibration that pulled Keisha back from her internal audit. He gestured toward the linen napkin, where the bleeding ink mapped out the Busan port seizure Choi had tried to trigger. "You were a ghost to them because they could not imagine a world where you were their intellectual equal. They saw the polyester blend of your uniform and assumed your brain was equally cheap and disposable." Keisha met the woman's gaze, her own resolve hardening into something cold and clinical. "I was invisible by necessity, but I was listening by habit," Keisha replied, her voice steady. She thought of Marcus Thorne, the mentor who had incinerated her career with a single, surgical betrayal. He, too, had underestimated the woman who looked for the truth in the margins. He had buried her evidence and replaced it with forged entries, thinking that once she was stripped of her CPA license and her midtown apartment, she would simply cease to exist. He had turned her into a digital stain, a pariah blacklisted from finance, never realizing that he was just training a hunter to work from the darkest shadows. Standing in the heart of this hidden estate, Keisha finally understood the moral of her own story. The world often confuses status with intelligence and volume with authority. Men like Choi and Thorne believed that because they held the pen, they controlled the entire narrative. But the narrative is always written by the person who sees the numbers clearly. Her strength wasn't in the Italian wool she used to wear, but in the logic that governed her soul, a logic that remained intact even when she was serving scotch to monsters. She had saved Myung-ok not because she believed the woman was a saint, but because she could not let an inaccurate ledger stand. The injustice of the poison pill contract had been a personal insult to her integrity, a reminder of the fire that had gutted her own life. Now, that fire was no longer a destructive force, it was a beacon. She was no longer a variable in an equation she didn't control. She was the auditor of the underworld, the one who would ensure that every single debt was paid in full. The dragon had spread its wings and offered her a dangerous new kind of visibility, one backed by the weight of an empire that understood the true cost of silence. As the cicadas hummed in the cold Georgia woods and the paper lanterns flickered, Keisha Simmons realized the hunt had only just begun. This time, she wouldn't be the one running from the shadows. She would be the one casting them across the city.